The desert tortoise is a dinosaur. It's been around for millions of years, pretty much unchanged. Fish and Wildlife Service consider the tortoise threatened with extinction, at risk of being lost, and it's unfortunately still in decline.
Has experienced catastrophic population decline.
The populations in critical habitat have declined approximately 50% in some areas between 2005 and 2011. That's a very steep decline.
You go back into the 1970s, there were 300 tortoises per square mile, and that sometime in the 80s, that crashed down to 20 or 25 tortoises per square mile.
Population densities have declined to a point where it's a collection of single individuals rather than a population. They're having a hard time finding each other.
In the Morongo Basin, the desert tortoises have a real chance of becoming locally extinct.
Generally, the biggest threat is what people do or won't do. Specifically, there's a whole list.
Habitat loss, predation, and disease, big three threats to desert tortoise.
We're both degrading habitat and erasing habitat. We fragment habitat by building roads and other linear structures like gas pipelines, utility lines, off-highway vehicle recreation. We get a lot of people out there that don't follow the law. They do not follow the rules, use their motorcycles, their quads in open desert.
If you drive an off-road vehicle in the desert, those tracks are going to stay indefinitely.
So that habitat loss has been a significant driver of the tortoise's decline. But we also see tortoise populations in decline in very, very remote areas, places with no people and no urbanization. And that's due to climate. Climate change is driving invasive species, grasses in particular.
Red brome is an example. It's a non-native grass.
And red brome is almost everywhere in the desert. It has a very detrimental effect to juvenile desert tortoises. They're eating the red brome, which reduces their health and their survivorship.
And tortoises will eat them. They'll feel like their bellies are full, but their bodies aren't able to extract proper nutrition.
So it makes them slower and more available to predation.
They can also spread wildfire.
Because these grasses have been introduced to the Southwest, we have an increased number of fires and bigger fires. Historically or prehistorically, the desert didn't have a lot of widespread fires because most of the time there's a lot of space between the fuel.
Desert vegetation communities are not adapted for a fire regime. That kind of environment can't support tortoises. They can't find shade resources under shrubs.
We are losing generations of desert tortoises.
Furthermore, because climate is such a threat, lack of large expanses of protected habitat, the loss of that habitat, means the tortoise is more vulnerable to climate change species-wide.
More and more roads and power lines, we kind of chop it up into smaller and smaller pieces. We have a fire in a piece over here. Will tortoises that are still living up here ever be able to get here? And so that's how connectivity matters from one place to another. And the other way that it matters is genetically. We know that it's healthy to have genetically diverse individuals in a population.
One of the other threats is grazing. And grazing occurs with both cattle and sheep.
May outcompete tortoises for a certain forage, so reducing their use at certain times of year.
That grazing action has spread a number of grass species into the desert. These areas burn easier.
Down in the Sonoran Desert, we lost about 12% of the adult female tortoises in one fire. And with a long-lived animal, that's a number that you don't want to lose all at once.
In 1990, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and specifically Ray Bransfield, prohibited sheep grazing over 2/3 of the critical habitat for the desert tortoise in the West Mojave. And that single act right there, I think, was probably one of the very best things we've ever done. Drought is another issue.
We're experiencing greater periods of drought, greater periods of sustained heat in the summer.
That causes a lot of stress in plant and animal populations, barely able to eke out an existence there. When I was doing a head starting study, I found one of the animals that I'd been tracking for a couple of years. It was waiting for a rainstorm, and it could tell it was about to rain, and it was thirsty. It was waiting for a drink. But the tortoise went to a rock, a flat rock that would pool water. And apparently it had gotten water in that rock in the past, and it had remembered this is a good place for a drink. And so as the storm was approaching, this little guy was just waiting in that flat rock in the depression, waiting for it to fill.
It appears that max temperatures play a really important role in determining how species survive changing climate. In southern Nevada now, we're up to weeks on end above 110 degrees. Climate means that tortoises are going to need to essentially migrate northward.
With the migration is that it's a very long-term view. Currently, the farthest north tortoises that we're aware of, at least in Nevada, are near Beatty. Those turn out to be really important because they're the long-term future of the species.
The hot winters are a problem. The hot lows at night are a problem, but it's really those peak daytime max temperatures that can drive species extinction.
A lot of different plants and animals will find it hard at some part of their life stage to be able to continue to exist. Tortoises have a special connection with temperature. The sex of the egg is determined by the temperature. And so a few degrees one way or the other, you can get either all males or all females. We can end up skewing the sex ratio of the desert tortoises. Now the question is that will the tortoises be able to modify where they put the nest? And that we don't know.
If we are fragmenting habitat, if we're expanding our cities, putting large-scale solar developments out in the middle of the desert, blocking those migratory routes, the tortoise needs open desert habitat to survive, and large blocks of connected habitat in particular. Sprawl development, developing out into the desert as opposed to filling in our cities, is really unsustainable. And the climate is a significant nexus for that. Pristine, open deserts, desert tortoise habitat, store carbon. So when we bulldoze open desert, we are losing the carbon sequestration potential.
Our world has been built on and has evolved with these ecosystems having a balance.
Large-scale solar projects have been a major impact on the desert tortoise, a conundrum of our time, how to deal with this solar rush.
First priority, enhancing rooftop solar, local solar.
And so we favor things like rooftop solar on the large scale.
Rooftops, on parking lots, on warehouses, on highways, on canals, in the built environment. We should cover every surface possible with solar panels in the built environment before we start looking to develop solar and desert tortoise habitat.
That would reduce the need for putting these large-scale solar developments in the desert. And there are areas in the desert that have been previously disturbed. Those areas might be better suited for solar development than these wide open, pristine areas in the desert.
Tortoises can't survive with solar, at least as it's been done. Now, there are attempts to try to ameliorate some of the impacts of large-scale solar development. The old style of development was you blade the entire area flat, which is a complete and utter decimation of the local ecosystem. There's nothing left. There have been moves now to do projects with mowing, where they would mow the vegetation. The Yellow Pine Project, the Gemini Project near Valley of Fire was approved with mowing. That's a way to maybe lessen the impacts, but I think there's an emerging narrative that this mowing is a substitute for just habitat preservation, and that's just not the case.
Solar will not solve all our energy needs. There are some that have to do with intensity of need that require a larger facility to produce it, but it could take up a lot. But the major issue is economics. The major issue is whether we are willing to let go of a dependency on large-scale economics and profits and go to smaller scale community-based economics.
However, the sort of political economy of energy means that we have this mode of production where our default is large centralized energy production sources that send transmitted through transmission lines to cities. And so utility scale solar out in the desert just kind of fits into that paradigm.
Now the government is incentivizing solar companies to develop in desert, often in really pristine desert habitat.
And meanwhile, large utilities make money hand over fist on utility scale solar. They don't make money off of you having solar panels on your rooftops. They lose money on it. Until we really revisit the whole structure of our energy economy and how and where we produce power and who owns the means of production of that power, we're never going to really get a grip on the utility scale solar issue. And the tortoise is going to continue to be in peril, which frankly is part of why there's support for bold transformational action for climate from my organization and others along the lines of the Green New Deal. One of the tenets of the Green New Deal is public power, where the public owns the utilities to create the power, the profit incentive is removed, and then there's no reason not to put solar panels on everyone's rooftop. But the tortoise needs rooftop solar to survive.
There's also threats from humans that cause deaths to tortoises, accidentally running them over, or some people intentionally run them over or intentionally shoot them.
And then there are a lot of other things that affect the quality of the habitat.
Vegetation changes, weed invasion that damages the nutritional value of what's out there for them to eat because, of course, they are long-lived herbivores.
Most common vegetation out there is creosote bush. They are very long-lived and slow-growing. 3 or 4 feet tall, can be 300-400 years old. And so if it's lost, it takes so long to recover.
People often associate this ancient mystic with these giant trees, and they don't look at the creosote, which is like, maybe 3 foot tall or something. The oldest creosote is about 11,000 years old.
But the other thing that's really helpful is the fact that we fenced so many of our roads, and our highways and our freeways now have tortoise-proof fencing along them.
We've got a lot of roads. We've got a lot of traffic. We want to build a lot more roads.
The more roads we have cutting across the desert, the more tortoises we tend to lose. And in that case, it's not just the little ones, but the big ones too.
We call roads mortality sinks, because what basically happens is a long-lived animal that lives near the road is going to end up on the road sooner or later and very likely be killed. What that does is opens up habitat, and more animals come in to that high-risk space, and so we call it a mortality sink. It has been shown here and in Britain and in Australia that people who apply a targeted technology of road fencing and road crossing make a difference.
Nevada in particular has been implementing a lot of desert tortoise proof fencing along busy highways and byways.
So they not only keep tortoises from being killed, they also keep other animals from being killed and providing food for ravens.
The ability to fence and the ability to provide crossings is a very viable mitigation for roads that have to be built if carefully done.
One of the threats is predation. And so what loves eating baby tortoises? Almost everything in the desert.
In terms of the long-term conservation and population viability, we need to address the raven problem. They're eating so many baby tortoises out there that we're seeing very few make it to adulthood these days. Ravens are exponentially increasing their numbers because of subsidies that they get from humans in town. And then they go out into the desert and eat more baby tortoises, songbirds, lizards, snakes. They're basically eating everything out there.
Ravens are a huge issue, especially in areas that have a lot of urban development.
Reducing the opportunity and the subsidies for predators, keeping the desert neat and clean.
There's things you can do to alleviate the raven problem. You can close your trash bins. You can make it harder for ravens to get food and water subsidies.
How do we protect the juvenile tortoises? There's some strategies where you put up an enclosure that's fenced, and inside that tortoise protective zone needs to have really good vegetation. It's called that head starting, where you can grow the tortoise up till they're harder and more resilient and more predator proof.
But again, that's a very labor intensive effort. Somebody who's maintaining these tortoises in these enclosures for years at a time. It is easier just to recognize where there are good populations and habitats for tortoises and protect them. With head starting, it's got to be coupled with raven control. Otherwise, you're just putting these juvenile tortoises out that'll feed ravens. Another technique that may be helpful is translocation of tortoises, where we take some tortoises that are in an area that's maybe been disturbed, and we can bring those individuals into populations where there's more resident tortoises. Coyotes can be a serious problem for tortoise populations. We've noticed that during periods of drought or extended drought over several years, you see populations of lagomorphs, which are rabbits and jackrabbits and rodents, tend to decline. Coyotes, which normally prey on those animals, can't find them, so they turn their attention to tortoises. Near towns, we see a lot of unleashed dogs, and these are either pets or possibly feral dogs. They like to prey on tortoises too. Feral dogs may eat them. The pet dogs are probably just using them as chew toys. We see a lot of tortoises that have been maimed, being chewed on.
And then they're also in trouble because of a disease. It's naturally occurring in the system. However, there's been a number of years of drought, and so the tortoises are not as resilient. So they've had big die-offs in certain areas.
It's really decimated the populations of tortoises. So between 2004 and 2014, half the tortoises in the best habitat disappeared, according to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Their problem is people releasing tortoises. If they have the upper respiratory tract disease, that can be transmitted to the wild population.
There are tens of thousands of tortoises in captivity. If you release captives, they're very likely to be carrying diseases. Keep wild tortoises wild, keep captive tortoises captive.
It's a very sensitive and delicate ecosystem. There are certain soils in the desert, certain landforms that once you disturb them, they're not coming back.
That, coupled with how the desert has been utilized as primarily this place for mining, energy production, it's thought of as a place where we can achieve a means to an end, not as a place that is worthy in itself.
One of the things we need to teach people is that the desert is not this wasteland.
And a lot of that comes from various sort of like military projects that have taken place out in the desert.
There's an anecdote that if you go to Southern California, where General Patton trained during World War II, you can still see tank tracks. And so the desert is very slow to recover. It's important to disturb it as little as possible.
As I've heard one time, and I don't know who told me this, who the quote originated from, but once you break ground in the desert, it's broken forever.
An overwhelming discourse of the desert as empty, as a place that's essentially like a garbage dump.
And that's kind of what people are treating it like with this off-road vehicle recreation. They think, oh, it's just a wasteland out there, so it can be my playground. I can drive around my motorcycle or my quad. What they don't realize is that the Mojave Desert is a diverse ecosystem.
The desert is a discriminated ecosystem. That concept of aridism, as far as ecosystems are concerned, there's still very much a hierarchy. Unfortunately for the desert, being such a vastly different place than the jungle or the forest often puts it being the shorter end of the stick. And we just don't associate arid ecosystems with biodiversity, which is just a huge misnomer.
Desert tortoise is an essential part of the biodiversity of the Mojave Desert. Biodiversity is the building blocks of life. It is what makes life possible.
Lots of endemic plants and animals, and it's a very sensitive ecosystem, definitely not a wasteland. So when we come in with these other disturbances, it just sends some populations of organisms over the edge. They're often, when an environment where they live is being disturbed or affected by human activities, tortoises are usually the first animal group to drop out.
So typically an indicator species is an animal that is more sensitive to some sort of ecosystem change.
So they're kind of a canary in the coal mine in letting us know how healthy this ecosystem is.
And when we see desert tortoises in areas thriving still, we know that area is relatively intact. Their habitat is protected under the Endangered Species Act. That habitat existing in its pristine form is able to consequently protect the other animals living on the land.
So for that reason, if you do focus on desert tortoise recovery in an area, you're going to end up benefiting a lot of other species as well.
Tortoises spend about 95% of their life in burrows underground.
Many, many creatures in the desert use those burrows for shelter, for shade, for refuge, from hiding from predators.
The burrowing owl. This is an animal that uses burrows of other animals. They also use tortoise burrows. If there's fewer tortoises, there's fewer burrows and fewer burrows for owls to use. And so that may be a cause of why we're seeing fewer burrowing owls these days.
There's a threatened ground squirrel called the Mojave ground squirrel, including a lot of rare plants.
And they also create trails through the creosote, and they help with spreading seeds around the desert as well.
If you protect the desert tortoise, you end up protecting a lot of other species
That might not have been afforded that otherwise. Their disappearance from there is going to be something that affects the entire ecosystem. People don't really quite understand what's so important about keeping one species alive. Well, it doesn't really affect my life, right? Any healthy ecosystem is going to require a balance of the predators, the prey, the plants that they eat.
It's a very complicated picture.
They manage to be this flagship species in a world where primarily charismatic megafauna, mammalian megafauna, are the ruling class. You think of the Serengeti, you think of lions, right? I struggled to find other places in the world that had a reptile as sort of the symbolic species.
The Desert Tortoise Council is a nonprofit volunteer group established over 40 years ago with the specific goal, mission statement of recovering the desert tortoise in the wild.
Our ultimate goal is scary because what we want is to recover the tortoise.
So the Desert Tortoise Council was started by biologists who study desert tortoises and were concerned when they saw that populations were declining.
The council was formed to provide a cooperative forum among government people, academic people, and local conservation organizations.
The untapped resource, the people that we're kind of missing is the general public.
Desert tortoise could benefit from more public engagement effort. There's a lot of room for educating younger people about the plight of the tortoise.
The education aspect is really important to us. So since 1991, we've had these workshops every year. One year we trained 330 people on how to do tortoise surveys and how to protect them during construction and so forth, to check under their vehicle to make sure that a tortoise hasn't crawled under there and won't be crushed. The Ecosystems Advisory Committee receive environmental impact reports that are all the documents that kind of show proposed projects. We spend so much time writing letters to try to make sure that projects don't unduly harm tortoises that we send to the Bureau of Land Management or the military or maybe to the counties, saying that this is a way that you can better protect the tortoise. Between 2013 and 2019, there were 344 projects. But in 2020 alone, we've had 102. There are really big things like the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, the West Mojave Route. We've also been pretty strongly involved in the Northern Corridor up in Utah. The reason it's so problematic is that 1995, Washington County, Utah, developed a conservation strategy with the two regulatory agencies. They basically said, we're going to protect this one area if you allow us to develop other areas. And so since 1995, they've been developing thousands of acres of tortoise habitat because they're protecting the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve. And now the Department of Transportation wants to put a new freeway through the reserve. I spent 70 hours just reviewing and commenting on that one project. Within a month, they had the final out. Probably it was already drafted. They didn't really respond to any of our comments. The Desert Tortoise Council is working with Conserve Southwest Utah to try to fight that freeway through a dedicated conservation area. You can't reclaim the habitat that's been lost. Our website, which is deserttortoise.org, all of the letters that I'm referring to get posted. There's a petition that came up at the same time as ours did for the tortoise to list the Joshua tree as an endangered species in California. If that happens, that's going to protect a lot more tortoise habitat as well. It'll become an umbrella species. Because all of our main protection right now is on public lands, mostly BLM, National Park Service, and some military. But if the Joshua tree becomes listed, then a lot of our private lands would also be protected. And that's one of the things that's missing right now from the formula. Joshua Tree National Park, It really thrives on volunteers. The Desert Tortoise Preserve Committee is like our sister organization, also thrives and uses volunteers to go out and clean up the Desert Tortoise Natural Area, Defenders of Wildlife, and other groups as well.
These are groups that are doing everything they can.
And we encourage people to get involved with us.
I would put out a call for people to join the Desert Tortoise Council. We want our membership to grow because we think that the more people that are in our organization, the louder and more powerful our voice is. The more members we have, the more money we have coming in, and we'll continue fighting for tortoises.
My organization has been involved in the courts for many years. Litigation can go so far. Saving the tortoise means forming a coalition for environmental justice and stopping climate-killing sprawl development. And a lot of that is the youth climate movement. Groups like the Center for Biological Diversity, where I work, Plan, Sierra Club, Sunrise Movement. These are groups who are pushing for bold change that will address climate change, that will stop the Clark County Lands Bill, stop unsustainable development.
It's just one of those things, something that's been around for so very long, that's disappearing during our lifetime.
They're not being protected to the degree that they should really be protected to actually recover the species.
The fact that they're just hanging there and not increasing, like we were able to do with the bald eagle, which I think was recently delisted because the numbers had come back.
They have recovered immensely from being on the brink of extinction. They're a great example of what can be accomplished.
We want to see the same thing with the tortoise. It's time to get that pulled together.
The threat of climate change, compounding the threat of habitat loss, combined to putting the tortoise on a pathway to extinction. Maybe we're still saving the tortoise in the short term. Maybe we haven't gotten extinction yet.
As the population declines further and further, there are less and less growing to adulthood. Tortoise hatchlings have such a high mortality rate. It's like 98%. The species needs the federal government, the state government, the local governments caring.
Now is the time, especially for young people, to get involved. Volunteer with your local political action organizations who are pushing for transformational change.
Advocate for more and more people in their community, not only to put in rooftop solar, but to be allowed to do so by the energy company, whichever one it is that serves you.
It's going to be up to us to let our legislators know that that's what we want. A lot of people to say, hey, we would rather see solar in town or close to town in disturbed areas.
Pushing back against the Clark County Lands Bill, pushing back against new sprawl into desert tortoise habitat is a very significant, tangible way that we can fight to save the desert tortoise.
We need to redirect solar projects away from the desert. We need to make sure that the Mojave Desert ecosystem, which is the largest wilderness area in the contiguous United States, remains that. We need to make it more remote, as I mentioned. We need to keep it off limits. We need to make sure that it remains a wilderness area.
And that means really scrutinizing climate policies. Not all climate policies are made the same. Some of them result in large solar plants in the desert that kill the desert tortoise.
And that's what it's going to take, is a lot of voices.
Educate people about alternatives, get involved.
It doesn't take many people. I've staged a protest with 3 people before, and we got on the evening news. I think we're at a very pivotal time in pursuing climate action, in changing the tides of the extinction crisis. We save the tortoise, we save the desert.
The longer we wait, the more deterioration there can be out there. And it's not likely to get better if we don't figure out a way to make it work.
It's on every one of us to take action.
Anybody can help desert tortoises, not just people who are studying them.
If a person wants to help finding a local organization, and there are always several, joining them and working with them might be the very best thing any person could do. You can go into the office and help them keep records. You can go to events and help them table. You can help getting materials to teachers.
There are on-the-ground opportunities, planting, weed removal, and trash removal.
Getting together, fighting for justice, and the broadened idea of what justice is to include the environment.
The urgent is that the populations are in severe decline almost everywhere across the range. The why is much more difficult. because it involves ethics and value judgments.
We can't give up. And it's going to take many, many years for these populations to recover.
Ultimately, one person can absolutely make a difference, and we don't know what the effects of the tortoise going extinct would be. We know that we are in an extinction crisis.
Tortoises are in trouble. They're in trouble because of humans.
It's appalling because it shows human failure, like more than anything else. Tortoise populations today being so starkly decreased from previous generations of tortoises, it's a direct reflection on us. And that's the hardest part.
It's our country, it's our planet, it's our honor privilege to protect it.
We need to change the mentality of our society. If you want to get to its base root, the extinction crisis threatens humanity's existence on Earth.
We're one of the causes of the problems, and so we need to be part of the solution.